at the tail end of Masechet Horayot. So we are on Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet. Today's Daf is Yud Gimel. But like I said, Daf Yud Dalet is very short. So these dafim are very long. So we'll leave a little space. So says the Mishnah, the second to last Mishnah actually on the page, around 15 lines on the bottom. Kohen Gadol Porei Milamata Lahedyot Milamala. We quoted this last night. We gave a little preview last night that there's differences between a Kohen Gadol and every other Kohen, right? The Torah specifically says about a Kohen Gadol, Rosho lo yifra, ubegadav lo yifrom. Don't let your hair grow out in mourning. Don't tear your clothing. And we talked yesterday about which Kohen Gadol does that apply to? A Kohen Gadol that got Meshuach, right? Kohen Mashiach, Merubah Bigadim, Meshuach Sha'avar, Meshuach Milchama. Those are the four categories, right? So we talked about that yesterday. Says our Mishnah today that a Kohen Gadol can tear his clothing when a person dear to him dies, but he doesn't tear it the normal way from the top being near the neck, presumably. We'll see in the Gemara. He does it from the bottom, let's say from the bottom of the clothing where it's less noticeable. But a Hedyot, a regular Kohen Hedyot, and of course a regular person, would do it milamala from the top. Kohen Gadol makriv onim v'lo ochel. Now, if a Kohen Gadol is an onain, again, an onain refers generally to just the specific day that a person buries their relative, who's a close relative, for that day and the rest of the
No,
day.
it's not correct. It's until he buries it.
So no, that's why I said it carefully. Midoraita aninut only is the day of burial, not till you bury. So if a mate dies, say on Thursday, and you bury on Sunday, midrabanan, we have all these rules of aninut. This again is a different discussion of elsewhere. We're going to have it in Zvachim, so we'll have it in a couple weeks. But the Doraita aninut is the day of the burial, and so up till the burial and after the burial till the end of the day. Again, there's drabanan beyond that. So the Kohen Gadol brings karbanot, and we learned that from Aaron, whose sons died, and he brought the karban, and he asked Moshe, "Can I eat the karban?" And Moshe said, "You can't eat the karban," but the fact that he brought it shows that he's allowed to work then, and other kohanim cannot. So he's makriv onein v'lo but he can't eat the karban. And a hedyot lo makriv v'lo ochel. A hedyot can't do avodah in the Beit Hamikdash that day, and of course he can't eat the karban. Says Rav, Amar Rav. And our Mishnah says that a Kohen Gadol is porei milamata. What does that mean? Lamata means lamata mamash. It means the bottom of his clothing, meaning from the bottom part, which is of course not going to be very noticeable. And lamala means lamala mamash. It means the top, meaning the neck, essentially. Or if they wore open thing, but somewhere near the top. Shmuel says no, that's not exactly what it means. What it means is lamata mikamei safa. It means below the safa. Safa is the ledge or the neck, the line at the top, meaning doesn't have to be the bottom of the clothing near his stomach, let's say, but it's somewhere below the neck. And lamala means mala mikamei or below the stitched part at the top. Lamala means above that stitched part at the top, mikamei safa. But both are referring to the top, meaning if Kohen Gadol ripped something at the bottom of his beged, it's not noticeable. It's like meaningless, right? No one sees it or notices it. It just means that it's clearly different than what's done by a Kohen Hedyot or a Yisrael. Mate, what about the following Breita? The Breita says, Al kol hametim kulan, any regular person who has a relative who dies, unfortunately, and he has to tear kriya, he has to rip his clothing. So Ratza, if he wants to, mavdil kamei safa shalo, if he wants, he can rip the safa, the neckline, totally open. Mavdil means he tears it a little bit, but he completely separates it. If he doesn't want to, he doesn't have to pull it completely apart, meaning he has to tear, but he doesn't have to rip it apart so that it's very noticeable. But al aviv alimo, for a person whose father or mother passed away, so it's a very, very deep mourning, then mavdil, right? Then you have to rip it apart completely, right? So what this seems to imply is that with the Kohen Gadol doing that, he would also be doing what a regular person is doing, and the Kohen Gadol is not supposed to be what someone is doing, right? So ask the Gemara, Kivan Tiba'alma Havikera, right? If normally it's considered to be tearing a person's clothing, even if they just rip it but don't pull it apart completely, then how could a Kohen Gadol do that? Kri kan begadav lo yifrom. Then why don't you say that this is against the principle that he's not allowed to tear his clothing? Meaning, if the Breita says that this is called a tearing for a regular person, not a mother or father, but a regular person, how could a Kohen Gadol do it? He's not allowed to do what a regular person does. Says the Gemara, you're right. This Braita, in fact, goes against Shmuel. But Shmuel has another Braita, Shmuel, another Tana. Shmuel ka Rabbi Yehuda Svirale. Shmuel's like the Tana Rabbi Yehuda. The Amr, because Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that, where am I? Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is, sorry, I'm doing this on my desktop. Rabbi Yehuda, I'm going to find it. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, what are we, 1, 2, 3, 4, 9 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yehuda has a statement, and this is now a quote from a Braita of Rabbi Yehuda, or a statement of Rabbi Yehuda, Kol kerash eno mavdil safa shelo, eno ela kerash shel tiflut. If you don't tear something and it's noticeable that, there's clearly a render, a rip in this garment, then it's just considered to be a meaningless tear, and it doesn't really count. So Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the Braita we just quoted, and would say that every time a person tears kriya, it has to be very noticeable. And therefore, if a Kohen Gadol does it, but it's not so noticeable, he's not over the Avera. Says Gemara, that's very nice that Shmuel holds to Rabbi Yehuda, but that's not internally consistent with Rabbi Yehuda. Immediately, the Rabbi Yehuda kriya by Kohen Gadol, does Rabbi Yehuda hold that there's any kriya by a Kohen Gadol? But Tanya, there's another Braita which says, Ilu Nemar, quotes the Braita, had the pasuk just said, Rosho lo yifra, right? A Kohen Gadol should not grow out his hair. Beged lo yifrom, he shouldn't tear his clothing. Hayiti Omer, I would have thought, we're not necessarily talking about a mate, right? About a dead, mourning over dead. Brosh beged shel sotah katuv midaber. Remember, this is similar things that we did by a sotah. She would expose her hair. They would tear her beged out off her in the Beit HaMikdash. Maybe that's what it's referring to, that a Kohen Gadol whose wife is suspected of being sotah shouldn't go through the bizayon of the regular woman because he's holy, and so it's a bizayon for the public, etc. How do you know it's referring to mita? Tamalomar. So therefore, says the Braita. Therefore, the pasuk says, "Et rosho lo yifra ubegadav lo yifro." So what do we learn from there, right? She'eno b'friya u'prima kol ikar. It's telling you is that it's not limited to a certain circumstance of a sota, but meaning not necessarily his wife is sota, sorry, I said, but that the Kohen Gadol doesn't do it for the sota. It's his head, right? So it's not that he doesn't participate in the act of tearing someone's clothing in, for example, the ceremony of the sota. It's his own hair that he can't let grow. It's his own clothing he can't tear out. She'eno bepri'a uprimat kol ikar. A Kohen Gadol has nothing to do with tearing clothing on a mate. Divrei Rebbe Yehuda, which again goes like against Shmuel. Shmuel says he can do, our Mishnah made it sound like he can do it from the bottom, and we had a debate about what the bottom means. But this Braita says, Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do it at all. And Rabbi Yishmael says, which is very similar to what our Mishnah said, no. It doesn't mean a Kohen Gadol doesn't tear at all. Eino poreim kederech shebnei adam porimim. He doesn't tear his clothing the way regular people would tear, meaning, as our Mishnah said, Elohu milamata, v'hadyu milamala. He does it from below, milamata, Hadyu does it from above. So you see, the question we're at from this is that clearly Rabbi Yehuda goes against our Mishnah, which is fine, right? But how could Shmuel say I'm relying on Rabbi Yehuda if Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree with our Mishnah at all? Says the Gemara, well, Shmuel suffered like Rabbi Yehuda b'chada, palila b'chada. Shmuel, it's true, Shmuel takes one opinion of Rabbi Yehuda about whether tearing kriya a little bit counts. Rabbi Yehuda says no, you got to tear it completely for it to be meaningful. And he argues with him on the fact that a Kohen Gadol does a symbolic act, even though Rabbi Yehuda says he does not. Okay. Next Mishnah now at the bottom, 4 lines from the bottom, 5 lines from the bottom, sorry, of Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet. Says the Mishnah, Kol tadir mechavero kodemet chavero. Anyone who is tadir, meaning more, anything, not anyone, any mitzvah, any act that is more frequent than another act, it comes first, right? If you've got to do 2 things, you do the one that's more tadir. We'll see in the Mishnah exactly, in the Gemara how we know this. Anything that's more holy, and we're going to see, this is why we're bringing this, of course, because we're trying to decide what's more holy than what. Anything that's more holy comes first. What is an example? Says the Mishnah, let's say you have the end of Masechet Horayot, right? So you have, they do a sin, they make a psak mistakenly, and the Kohen HaMashiach does the sin, and all the people do the sin. So then you have to bring a par HaMashiach, right? The Kohen HaMashiach brings a par, sorry, and you have to bring a par for par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, for par Ha'ida. Let's say it's whatever, Sunday, they decide we're going to bring these 2 parim, and they're both standing there. Which one comes first? So par HaMashiach, par Ha'ida umdim, they're standing there in the Azara, 2 karbanot to be brought. Says the Mishnah, par HaMashiach kodem. The Para Mashiach comes first. The Par of the Kohen Gadol, Lipar Ha'ida, comes before the Par of the Tzibor, Bechol Ma'asav, for all of its actions. Says the Gemara, we'll see why in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, Menani Mili. Now, how do we know that what's Tadir? Forget about what's holy, right? We'll get to that question in a second. But how do you know that what's Tadir, what's more frequent, gets priority? Amar Bayad Amar Krab, because the pasuk says, Milvad Olat Haboker, right? We talk about bringing all the karbanot on the Musaf, on the holidays, and on Shabbos, and we always say, besides the Olah of the morning, Asher Olah Tamid, which is the Olah that is frequent. That seems like a redundant or extra pasuk, right? Because we know, right? Where am I? Take out the next two words. Michli. Chdiv olata boker. It says the olah of the morning. That's the tamid. Everyone knows that. Olata tamid lamali. Why do you have to say again, repeat that it's olata tamid? It's telling you this principle. Hachi kamer. Right? This is telling you that the fact that it's koda, that it's tamid, is important. Right? It's not just a question of how holy is the carbon, how important is it, it's how frequent it is. Hachi kamer rachmana called it tadira kadma. That whatever is frequent gets priority. Now, again, that's assuming there's similar kedusha, right? If something is more holy, it might come first. But if they're equal, the more frequent one comes first. And the second principle of our Mishnah, 2 lines on the bottom, is called mekudash mechavero hu kodem et chavero. Anything that is more kodesh, we'll see how we define that. Minala. Now, what's the source for that? The Tana de Bereb Yishmael, Tana Bereb Yishmael, v'kidashto. It says by the Kohen that you are mikadesh the Kohen, right? What does it mean you're mikadesh the Kohen by l'chol davar shebekdusha? It means that for everything that is related to kedusha, the Kohen comes first. L'ftoch rishon, he gets to open first. Open always means reading the Torah, getting the first aliyah, as we do. L'varech rishon, he gets the first right in Birkat Hamazon. We always ask a Kohen to do zimun. L'toma nayafer rishon, when you're passing out nice things, it's nice. You're supposed to give kavod to the Kohen to get the first portion. And that is based on the pasuk, and therefore that's what our Mishnah means. In terms of the Gemara, Taf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, the top line, the next thing our Mishnah said, if you have two animals standing in front of you, Parko and Mashiach, Upara Ha'edah, we say the Parko and Mashiach comes first. Why? Minani Mili. How do you know that? The Tana Rabbanan, there's a Braita, because the Braita says very interestingly. It says when this is in the end of Vayikra, when it's talking about these karbanot, it says v'saraf oto. You should burn it. This is actually referring to the karban of the par helam davar, kishkasher saraf et par rishon. The way you burnt the first par. What do you mean the first par? Say the other par. Matam lamer harishon. It's telling you shei rishon kodem that it's first. Meaning kodem lepar eida b'chol masav. The par of the Kohen Mashiach comes before the par of the Eidah. Tanur Abanan says the Braita, par Kohen Mashiach par Eidah umdim. Right, this is the case of our Mishnah. You've got two pars for people doing averot by pasking incorrectly. One is from a personal person, a Kohen Agadol, Kohen Mashiach, and the other is the whole tzibor, the Par Ha'edah. Says the Braita, like our Mishnah, Par Kohen Mashiach Kodem the Par Ha'edah b'chol masav. The par of the Kohen Mashiach goes first. Why? So our Braita adds a reason. Mashiach mechaper, the Kohen Mashiach is the one who brings the kapara, right? Because the Kohen Mashiach is the one who does karbanot and is mechaper for Bnei Yisrael. The Eidah is mitkaper. They're passive, right? They're the ones who get the kapara from the karban. They don't bring the karban. So dinu shiachdim hamichaper lemitkaper. That therefore we always would prioritize the one whose action leads to kapara, the one who gets a kapara, the active one instead of the passive one. And Chinu Omer, this obviously is very apropos to Yom Kippur, because as we read on Yom Kippur now, v'chiper ba'ado uva'ad beto v'ad kol kal Yisrael. Remember on Yom Kippur, the order is that the Kohen does the kapara for himself first, first par, then ba'ad beto for all the Kohanim, and then the third time, as we of course read in the Musaf, is for the Sayir HaMishtalech for kol kahal Yisrael. Or the par or Sayir Nasa Bifnim. So those are the three, that's the order. Now, that's the two things. But what about, let's get to some other orders. Says the Gemara now, par helam davar shel tzibor, if you have the par of the tzibor, which we said goes after the Kohen Gadol, but what about if you have a par shel avodah zara, right? So remember the halacha was that if the tzibor is over an avera in the Torah, the whole tzibor, they bring a par helam davar, except for avodah zara. Remember, in the case of avodah zara, you bring a sa'ir and a par, right? But by avodah zara, the par is actually an ola, and the sa'ir is a chatat. right? So it says, what if you have again two parim, the par of the Helen Davar Shel Tzibor and the par of Avodah Zarah? They did all the actions, right? They were Michal Shabbat, so they bring a regular par, and they were over Avodah Zarah, so they bring a par and a Sa'ir for Avodah Zarah. So which one goes first? My timer says, says the Braita. The par Helen Davar goes first. My timer. What's the reason? Because Hai Chatat v'Hai Olah. Because the par of the Tzibor is a Chatat, the par of Avodah Zarah, remember, is an Olah. And a chatat goes first. So Tanya, because the Braita said, "Hikriv et asher the chatat rishona." Torah says you bring the one of a chatat. This is referring to the Olevi Yored. You bring the karban chatat first. Matam alomer. Why is it telling you that? In lelamed shtei chatat rishona. If it's there to tell you the plain meaning, harik far number, it already says that hasheni yaseh olah kamishpat. The second karban is brought in olah. So I understand that the first karban is a chatat. So why do you specifically say asher the chatat rishona? Elizem banaav. This is a general principle. Whenever you have a pair, which we have, frequently, a pair of birds or a pair that one's a chatat or by mitzorah or by yoledet, that one is a chatat and one is an olah, the chatat goes first, right? And kaimalan, and we have a principle that ifilu chatat of kodem and olata behima, even if one is a bird, which is a much less, respectable karban, that comes first before an animal that is brought as an olah. And so therefore, that's a separate halacha. It's nothing to do with our Mishnah, but that is the halacha why a par of Helam Davar Shel Tzibor goes before a par of Avodah Zarah. Now, what if you have a par of, remember, Avodah Zarah, recall, was two karbanot. It was a par for an olah and a sa'ir for a chatat. So par Avodah Zarah, kodem sa'ir Avodah Zarah. Says the Gemara again, the par of Avodah Zarah, even though it's an olah, goes first before the sa'ir of Avodah Zarah. Amai says, well, why? Hai chatat v'hai olah. You just told me a different principle. You said that a carbon chatat goes before a carbon olah. So why in the world would this be an exception? Why would the olah of the Avodah Zarah, which is the par, go before the chatat of the Avodah Zarah, which is the sa'ir? Says the Gemara, you're right. This is a very, very unique exception. Ami b'marava, they said in the West, in Eretz Yisrael, Mishmei de Rava bar Mari, because if you look at the psukim, when it talks about the karban of the chatat of Avodah Zarah, it's written without an aleph. It's written chet tet taf. Chatat Avodah Zarah chasera aleph. It says the chatat ktiv. Or Rava says mishpat ktiv be, because it says the word mishpat, which tells you it has to be similar to the other order where basically the par helam davar goes first. But the point is that there's a special limud by the Avodah Zarah that you bring the sa'ir, you bring the par, right, which is an olah, before the sa'ir, which is a chatat. Usually it's not that way, but this is an exception. So that is the limud. Continues the Gemara. The next priority question is, where are we up to?
Yeah, Mishtaleach.
Thank you. What's the third line, right? Here we go. Sa'ir Avodah Kochavim. No, it's not the Mishlech. The Sa'ir Avodah Kochavim, which is the third wide line on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Let's say you have a Sa'ir of Avodah Zarah, right? Remember, when the whole tzibor sinned, they brought a par and a Sa'ir. The whole tzibor sinned for Avodah Zarah, specifically. They brought a par for an Olah and a Sa'ir for Chatat. Remember, and when a king sinned, he brought a sa'ir in general, right? Unlike the par of the Kohen Gadol and the par of the Tzibor, he brought a sa'ir. Let's say you have these two karbanot in front of you, a sa'ir of the community who did Avodah Zarah, and a sa'ir of a nasi who's a personal sa'ir for an avera. Which one goes first? Says the Gemara, sa'ir Avodah Zarah, the Tzibor for Avodah Zarah, kodim the sa'ir nasi. My time, why? Because of what I just said. Hai Tzibor v'hayachid. One is for the public, and one is for the private, and you go with the public first. But Sa'ir Nasi Kodum Sirat Yachid. But if you have two people, one is a king, and he has to bring a Sa'ir for doing an Avera, and then a regular guy or woman brings a Sa'ira because they were Mechal Shabbat by mistake, the Nasi goes first. My time, right? Obviously the king, not obviously, but the king goes first before a regular person. Now, this gets very interesting. It's all very interesting. Remember that a individual who has to bring a Karban Chatat has an option. You can bring a Si'ira or a Kisba, right? You can bring a goat, which is a Si'ira, or a Kisba, which is a lamb, right? Something like that. Okay? So says let's say in the Beit HaMikdash you have two people show up at the same time. One is a Si'ira for his sin, and one is a Kisba. Says the Gemara, Si'irat Yachid Kodem Kisbat Yachid. The Sa'ir goes first. Okay, this is the bigger animal. We'll see why. Oh, actually, we're going to see why in a second. Hatanya, there's another brighter that says the opposite. That says kivsat yachid kodem l'sirat yachid. That a kevis comes first. Amar Abaye Tanahi. It's a machloket Tanaim. Mar savar asira difa. One Tana holds that a sa'ir is better. The goat. Shekain nitraba eitz avodah zarah b'yachid. Because look, the sa'ir is brought for the avodah zarah. You don't bring a kevis for avodah zarah. So clearly, there's more forgiveness and more priority for a sa'ir. Well, Mar Savar Kivsa Difa, but the other Tana holds that the keves, the lamb, I think lamb's the right word, but a sheep, let's say, is adif shekain nitrabta ba'alya. Remember that a female sheep has this extra fat on the tail that we bring on the mizbeach, so it's basically an extra portion that is more beautiful and nicer, and therefore it should go first. Finally, right before we get to our next Mishnah, what about the Omer, right? So remember that you bring a Karban HaOmer on Pesach. With the Omer, you brought an animal, right? You brought the matzah, and you brought a kevis. Says the Braita, this is a continuation of a Braita, but we're quoting it separately. Omer kodem the kevis habayimo. The carbon Omer is brought on the Mizbeach before the kevis. The shtei halechem of Shavuos are kodem the kivasim habayim imahem. And this is the principle. Davar haba b'gil yom kodem davar haba b'gin lechem. Something that's brought for the day, which is the carbon omer and the carbon shtei halechem, is first, and then the animal is brought because of the bread, right? So because you bring the animal with the omer, and the omer is done for the day, the omer goes first, and the animal comes next. Okay, that's the priority. Continues the Mishnah. The next Mishnah, we are at I don't know where we are, wide lines, like the 8th wide line. It says the Mishnah, Ha'ish kodem le'isha. A man comes before a woman. We're not even on this call, but if you have to redeem, this generally is referring to people who are pidyan shvuyim, right? So that generally, if someone needs to be redeemed or needs to be saved, you save a man before a woman, la'chayot, to keep him alive, u'lashiv aveda, and if you have something to return to that person, you do it first. Does Rashi say it here? The Rambam says because, Rashi does not say it here, but the Rambam says it's because, we'll see actually in the Gemara, but the Rambam says because a man is chayv in more mitzvot than a woman, so therefore you go for him first because he can do more mitzvot. Ha'isha kodemet le'ish. Now, a woman in general would be before a man if the issue was needing to be clothing, the chasot, or to be redeemed from captivity. So not what I said first, because generally we think that women are more vulnerable or more sensitive to those things. And again, it would be circumstance, right? We think obviously for Beit HaShevi is that they're going to be taken advantage of and be more likely to be raped. So therefore you want to redeem them. And for clothing, it's also that they're more sensitive to the need for clothing. But if you're worried that both will be taken advantage of sexually, then the man should come before the woman, just like in the Reisha, because he is chayav in mitzvot. Tanur Abanan continues the Braita. Let's get some more hagdarot here. Hayahu va'aviv rabo b'shavi. Let's say you have a scenario where a person, his father, and his teacher are together in captivity, and he is raising money. I don't exactly know how it worked to redeem them. So who should he go for first? Who kodem l'rabo? First of all, you come first, right? And that's one of the very important principle, right? You never, and this is true almost about everything. You always save yourself before somebody else, right? Because there's a responsibility for yourself. So first, a person should redeem himself. Next, rabo kodem la'aviv. He should then redeem his his teacher before his father, because his teacher, taught him Torah and brings him to Chayolam Haba. But Imo kodemet lekulam. But if his mother is captive, she goes first before all of them, not necessarily before him, but before his teacher and his father. Okay, because as we said in our Mishnah, a woman is far more vulnerable in general to being taken advantage of and being mistreated than a man. Chacham kodem lemelech Yisrael. Now, if you have in captivity, let's say, or you need to, save someone, a wise person, a Talmud Chacham, goes before a king because Chacham shemet ein lanu ki yotze bo. If a smart person, a Talmud Chacham dies, you can't just replace that person. You need someone who has that skill and to teach them. But Melech Yisrael shemet, when a king dies, it's really not hard to find a replacement. You just look for some family. Now it's not so easy, but it's a lot easier because the principle is Kol Yisrael Ruyim L'Malchut. In theory, anyone could be a king, right? Meaning, in practice, that's not the case. They fight over it. But in theory, anyone is going to be the king. Not anyone can be a Talmud Chacham. Now, Melech Kodem the Kohen Gadol, a king comes before the Kohen Gadol, and that's based on a pasuk. Remember, because it says we had this pasuk yesterday. Vayomer HaMelech lahem kichui machem et avdei adonechem, and go down and remember this is when they went down to the Gichon to coronate Shlomo. But David says to them, bring the servants, and we understand that the servants are referring to Tzedakah Kohen Gadol. So you see that the Kohen Gadol is considered to be the servants of the Melech. But the next principle is Kohen Gadol Kadem Navi. Let's say you've got a Kohen Gadol and a Navi, again, both being captive or both needing food or parnasa of some sort. The Kohen Gadol comes first. Shenemar, and this is based on this is continuation of that pasuk by Shlomo. It says Mashach Oto Sham. They anointed Shlomo there by the water. Tzadok HaKohen v'Natan HaNavi. So you see that Hikdim Tzadok l'Natan. That Tzadok HaKohen, who was the Kohen Gadol, came before Natan HaNavi. And there's another pasuk. This pasuk, very, very different context in Zechariah, where it says, "Shma na Yehoshua Kohen Hagadol Atav Reacha," who are Yoshvim Lefanecha. Right? He says the nevuah is to Yehoshua Kohen Hagadol, you and your friends. Now, who are his friends, right? Yachlad Yototayu, maybe it's just his buddies. They're sitting around, they're chatting. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, Ki anshe mofet hema. They are people of wonders. Ein mofet el navi. Mofet always means they can prophecy. Shenemar natan alecha oto mofet. So it shows you that Yoshua Kohen Gadol was sitting, and Hashem said to him, or the Navi said through Hashem, you and your friends, implying that you are first, and the Nevi'im, your friends, are secondary to you. The next group is different kinds of Kohanim Gedolim, right? Remember, a Meshuach b'Shemen HaMishcha, a Kohen Gadol who had Shemen HaMishcha, he is the greatest in priority, and he is Kodem l'Meruba Bigadim. He comes before a Kohen Gadol who is just became Kohen Gadol through Meruba Bigadim. Period, comma, I guess you could put there. And we're smack in the middle of the daf, middle of the line, between the two Mishnayot. A Meruba Bigadim, a Kohen Gadol, who was the Kohen Gadol because he wore the 8 clothing, is Kodem Meshuach Shavar. He is better than a Meshuach who had, remember the criteria was a king, a Melech, a Kohen Gadol, who then became Pasul for some reason. But that is Machmat Kiryo, right? Period. Meshuach Shavar. Read it wrong. Meshuach Meruba Bigadim, there's no parenthesis, there's no punctuation there. Is Kodem L'Mashuach Shavar Machmat Kiryo. He's first before a Meshuach Shavar because he saw Keri, meaning he had an involuntary sort of emission, so he's pasul because he's tamei, but he knows that's going to end, right? Because the day's over, he'll go to the mikvah and he's back in his job. So although at that moment he's not actively a Kohen Gadol because he can't function, he is still very close. But the next principle is that a Meshuach Shavar Machmat Kiryo, a Kohen Gadol who is temporarily unavailable because he's tamei, is Kodem Avar Machmat Mumo, is prior to a Kohen Gadol who's unavailable because he has a mum, because you don't know when that mum is going to end. And if Kohen Gadol is sick, you don't know if he's going to get better. You don't know when he's going to go back to work. One who's got a tuma, you know when it's over. Avar Machmat Mumo, and a Kohen who is a Kohen Mashiach, who is no longer functioning because he's got a mum temporarily, he is Kodem, the Mashiach Muchama. He comes before this, remember the third level we had Kohanim Gedolim, who's not a real Kohen Gadol, but he's called anointed to lead them into war. And Mashiach Muchama Kodem L'Skan, the Kohen Mashiach Muchama comes before the Skan, who is the appointed, Skan Kohen Gadol, the deputy assistant Kohen Gadol. And Skan Kodem LaAmarkal. The Skan Kohen Gadol comes before the Amarkal. Who's the Amarkal? Never heard of this guy before. My Amarkal. Amar of Chisda, he is the general contractor. Amar Kula, he's the one who says everything. Meaning he's like the chief of staff, we'd probably call him, right? So he's not officially anointed, but he's the one who's got really a lot of power. But he has precedence, but he's down on the list. And then Amarkal Kodem Li Gizbar. Amarkal comes before the treasurer. Gizbar Kodem Li Rosh Mizbar. The treasurer comes before the head of the Mishmar. Remember, Mishmar was every week there was a Mishmar. So there was one person the head of that week. Rosh Mishmar Kodem Li Rosh Beit Av. Remember, each day was split up into a Beit Av, 6 days. And so the head of the Mishmar comes in front of the head of the Beit Av. Rosh Beit Av, Kohen Hedyot. And this is the order. So the Rosh Beit Av is an head of the Kohen Hedyot. Now, ask the Gemara, Ibaylu. This is the order, right? Ask the Gemara now where I have a hay in mind. So if that's helpful, 4 lines.
Could you please it's time to go to shul. Can you please indicate where you stopped? You don't always do that. So if you could, when you finish the Gemara, I have
Yeah,
to.
absolutely. Be happy to. Okay, Ibailo, asking right now, right before the Mishnah, right? We're at the hay, the 4 lines of the Mishnah. Linyan tum'ah. In regards to tum'ah, meaning, let's say there's a mate mitzvah, right? So usually Kohen does not be mitameh to a mate mitzvah, but one day basically the Kohen Gadol is walking down the road and they see a mate mitzvah. So if there's two Kohanim, you should pick the one with less kedusha to be mitameh. So linyan tum'ah says the Gemara skan u'mashuach milchama. You have not a Kohen Gadol, you have the skan Kohen Gadol. So it's the assistant and the Meshuach Melchama, the one who was anointed to lead the war. Which one should be Tamnei first? Meaning, which one is less Kaddish? Amar Marzuch Reder of Nachman Tashma. Let's bring it from a Braita, the Tanya. Skan u'Meshuach Melchama shayim malchim b'derech. Right? You have a Skan Kohen Gadol and a Meshuach Melchama walking down the road. Upaga b'hem meit mitzvah. They bump into a meit mitzvah. They find on the side of the road a corpse, and there's no one to bury it. Mutav sheyitamei Meshuach Melchama v'ayitamei Skan. The one who should become tamei should be the one who leads them to war, and not the Skan Kohen Gadol. Why? She'im ye'era bo psul b'Kohen Gadol nichnas Skan m'shamesh tachtav. Because the Skan needs to be ready. The Skan's role is that if the Kohen Gadol falls out of favor because he gets tamei or pasul or a wound, then the Skan gets elevated. So the Skan needs to be ready to go. The Kohen Meshuach Melchama, if he's not ready, he's not ready. But Tanya, there's a Braita that says Meshuach Melchama kodem the Skan. That the Meshuach, we quoted it a few lines ago, that the Meshuach Melchama comes before the Skan. That's referring to his priority in Kedusha in order to save the person, keep them alive, redeem them. But in terms of Tumah specifically, the Skan Kohen Gadol has an important role, and therefore he has to come first, and he does not become Tameh. Okay, continues the Mishnah. Kohen Kodem LaLevi. Right, a Kohen comes before a Levi le Yisrael, a Levi comes before Yisrael a Mamzer, Yisrael who's kosher, family, comes before Yisrael who's a Mamzer le Natin. Remember the Natinim were these group that converted under false circumstances, but Yoshua accepted them, and so they're essentially converts, but we don't favor them. And a Natin leger, Natin comes before a ger. A ger here means a ger who himself converted. So not the children of a ger, which is essentially what a natin is, right? Children of those people. But the ger himself or herself comes next. And ger la'evan mishuchar, a ger takes precedence over a slave, a member, an Evan Kanani, who's freed by their master, becomes Jewish, right? But they have a category of an Evan mishuchar. They're essentially a ger, but they're a little bit of a lower level of a ger. Now, when is this true, says our Mishnah, that you go precedence based on, what status a person has? That's bisman shekulam shavim. If they're all equivalent in their knowledge and their commitment and their actions. If the mamzer is a scholar and the Kohen Gadol is an ignorant person, then mamzer talmid chacham kodem the Kohen Amaretz, Kohen Gadol Amaretz. Then the Talmid Chacham goes first, even if he's a mamzer and the other one's a Kohen Gadol. So this is only if everything else is equal, not if one has greater knowledge. Now, how do we know all this stuff? Says the Gemara, Kohen Kodem Levi. How do you know a Kohen comes for Levi in the beginning of the Gemara? Shenemar, because it says in this is also in Divrei Yamim, it says Bnei Amram, Aaron Moshe, right? Aaron Moshe, and Vayibadel Aaron Lakdisho Kodesh Kodashim. Aaron was separated to be even holier. So you see, Aaron is more holy than in this regard than Moshe. Levi Kodem Lisrael. How do you know that a Levi comes first? Shenemar Be'itayi Avdil Hashem at Shevet Levi mituch Kal. Right? Hashem, not mituch. Hashem brought Shevet Levi to carry L'Seitat Aaron Hashem. So you see, that's Levi. Yisrael kodem mamzer. How do you know that Yisrael is before a mamzer? That's just logical. Shezem miyuchas, v'zeinu miyuchas. One has yichus, one has heritage that we know they come from appropriate relationships, and one does not. Mamzer kodem l'natin. How do you know that a mamzer who's a Jew comes before basically the natin, which are again generations of converts? Because zeba mitipak shera v'zeba mitipak psula. Because a mamzer at least is Jewish, and even though his parents or someone in his lineage did an act that was inappropriate, they were Jewish. So it's a tibak shira. But the nitin of going many generations back came from a tipa psula of a non-Jewish tipa literally means a seed, right? But a drop. Nitin kodem leger. Why did the Netinim come before the Ger? Because Zeg Gadali Manu B'Kedusha. Because the Netin, again, we're referring to the Netinim, became converts many, many generations ago. So the children now grew up as regular people, regular Jews, B'Kedusha. But Ger, who's himself converted, Zeh Lo Gadali Manu B'Kedusha. He grew up not as a Jew and only became a Jew. And a Ger, Kodem Levin Mishuchar, why does a Ger come before an Eved? Because Zelia Bechlal Arur, Zelia Bechlal Arur, because there's a special curse, unfortunately, that, or fortunately, I don't know, that we say about Canaan, right? That Canaan is going to be Eved Lamo, right? That we'll see, we'll quote it. And so because of that, there is an aspect of klala that goes on all people who were once upon a time slaves. Now, again, we accept them, but it makes them lower down in the hierarchy. Now, Ematai said the Mishnah Bizman Shkulam Shavim. But if a Kohen Gadol is an Amaretz and a Mamzer is a Talmid Chacham, the Mamzer comes first. Not immediately. How do we know that? Amar Vacham Bar Chanina Damakra Yikarahi Mipninim. The Torah is talking about the Mishnah is talking about Torah is more precious than pininim, right? Now, pininim is a strange word for, usually we translate it as jewels, as rubies, but it's referring to, we say, Kohen Gadol shenichnas lifnai v'lifnim. Pninim means the one who goes inside. Even if a Kohen Gadol goes inside, if someone has Torah, they are greater than that Kohen Gadol. Tanya Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai Omer. Says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you know, where are we up to? 7 lines in the bottom, right? Rashbi, it says in mine. You know, the truth is that an Evan Mishuchar, if a person was a slave in a Jewish home and then got freed, that person should really be before a ger, because the Evan Mishuchar, Gadal Imanu Biktusha, right? The Evan Mishuchar was a slave to a Jew, so he grew up in a Jewish home, knowing all the rules, and then became free. A ger grew up in a non-Jewish society, doing whatever he did before he converted. But Zelo Gadali Manu B'Kedusha, the ger did not grow with us in Kedusha. Elazaya Bichlal Arur. But the problem is that there was the curse on Canaan, right? That he'll be Arur Canaan, right? And therefore Zelaya Bichlal Arur, and therefore the convert who was not from Canaan is not part of the Arur, and he comes first. Shalu Talmidav et Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok. This is a very interesting question. I don't really know the context, but the students asked Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadok 3 lines on the bottom. Is that what we're up to? No, 5 lines on the bottom. Shalu Talmidav et Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok. Mipnei ma kol ratzin lisa giyoret. Meina kol ratzin lisa mishucharet. Why is it that if you look on dating sites, again, I don't really know what the context, that everyone wants to marry a convert, right? They're very popular. People want to marry a woman who grew up non-Jewish and became a convert. But nobody wants to marry a slave who was freed, who are essentially a convert, right? Why is there such desire to marry a woman who became a convert and not a woman who was freed as a slave? Amar Lam, and he says it's because people subconsciously know because one was Bichlal Arur, because the slaves have this curse about them, that there's something about them that's not as good. Another explanation, of course, is that like a regular person, even a non-Jew, has a certain privacy and dignity because they have control over themselves. But a slave, sadly, does not. They weren't protected, meaning that people take liberties with slaves that they wouldn't with free people. Now, while the students are asking Rabbi Elazar questions, they came up with the next question. And again, these are a little bit strange and interesting questions, but I can relate to some of them, not all of them. Next question they asked him was, why are dogs such good pets and cats are terrible pets? Right? Why is it that a dog shows a lot of loyalty and a cat doesn't show any loyalty to its owner? Now, I think people say that. I don't know anything about dogs or cats, but that's what people claim. Amar Lam, he said, well, you know why? We're going to say in a minute that people who eat food that has been eaten from by a mouse, they forget their things. I don't know. They don't have good memory. So, but the ochel achbar atzmo, so the cat, which eats the mouse itself, alachad v'kama, that its brain is a little bit scrambled. So eating mice doesn't makes you forget who you're connected to. Again, we'll see why we say that in a second, but again, I'm not really sure. Shalut Hamidav Rabbi Eliezer students asked Rabbi Eliezer probably a question that you've all been thinking of, which is why does everybody take advantage of mice? You know, mice are these cute little things. Why is everyone angry and trapping and killing mice? Right? We ask this question in our house all the time. We're big mouse fans, right? Why are people so scared and frightened of mice? They're just cute little animals, like squirrels. So why is everyone Moshlu Achbarim? Mipnei Shesuran Ra, because they have an evil, I don't know how to translate it in English, but they've got really evil thoughts. What does that mean? Mahi, Rava says because afilu glimat gaitza, because look at mice. They even gnaw at your coat. Meaning mice eat up everything. They don't really even care about whether it's going to give them food or not. They're just wicked little creatures. I don't know what they had against mice. I love mice. But turn the daf to your Gimel Amabet at the top. Rav Papa says, no, no, no. You know why? Because I feel shufta demaragaitza. They even would gnaw away at the handle of the hoe of the instrument. Meaning they don't just eat for nourishment. They eat because they, I don't know, are just evil creatures that want to consume things. Tanura Banan says the Braita. This is why we quoted this. There are 5 things that make you forget your knowledge. If you eat food that was eaten by a mouse, so you should cover your food at night. Or something that a cat ate from. If you eat the heart of an animal, if you eat a lot of olives. If you drink the water that not you drink, you pour the water, you drink water that remains after you do the laundry, even if you filter it. If you wash one foot on top of the other, I guess the dirty water from one goes on the other. Those things for some reason make you forget your learning. Some say someone who puts his clothing, meaning his kelev means clothing usually here, under his head when he sleeps. If you sleep with your clothing as a pillow, again, no idea why. And there are 5 things that help make you remember your forgotten information. Pat pichamim, if you have bread that's baked on coals, and kol shkein pichamim atzman, and certainly if you have a coal, not that you eat the coal, but if you warm yourself up to the coal, meaning you eat hot bread, it warms you up, but if you actually sit by the fire, it's even better. Hotel beitza migulgelet below melech, if you eat a beitza migulgelet without salt, migulgelet generally means it's hard, right? Haragil b'shem and zayit, if you use a lot of olive oil, so not olives, but olive oil. Haragil b'yayin b'samim, you have a lot of wine and spices. If you drink the water that's left over after the dough is needed, I guess there's a lot of vitamins, nutrients in that. If you dip your fingers in salt and then eat your food. Now, let's do these quickly. I'm going to try to get to the end of the narrow lines, if that's okay. A couple more minutes. Haragil, even though tomorrow you'll have plenty of time for all of this. Haragil b'shem and zayit. It's good to have Shem and Zayit. Misayel Rabbi Yochanan. Then Rabbi Yochanan Kshem Shazayit Mishakech Talmid Shel Shivim Shana. Rabbi Yochanan said, just like eating olives makes you forget things you've known for your whole life. Kach Shem and Zayit Mishiv Talmid Shel Shivim Shana. The oil of the olives makes you remember things. Haragil b'yayin b'shemen. No, it's good to have wine b'samim. Sorry, b'yayin b'samim. Misayel Rava. The Amar Rava Chamra v'reichani pakchin. That spices, wine and spices make you smart. I don't know how much wine, maybe in moderation. Hatovel etzba'o b'melech. If you dip your fingers in salt, it's a good thing. That means you dip one finger. Again, I have no idea what that means. At Kitzanai, in fact, it's machloket tanaim. Rabbi Yehuda Amar achat v'lo shtayim. If you dip one finger, not 2 fingers. Yossi says shtayim v'lo shalosh, 2 fingers and not 3 fingers. V'simanech kmitza, and they made a symbol of a kmitza, which is you put down your ring finger and you have 2 fingers on one side and one on the other. So that's the simon. Now, finally, we'll finish these last lines. Asarad Dvarim Kashim Talmud. There are 10 things that make it hard to learn or make it quick for you to forget your limud. Oh, Ver Tachat Afsar Gamal. If you go under the afsars, the what's it called in the mouth of the camel, the rope that you pull the camel with. If you go under the camel's rope, the bit. V'koshkin Tachat Gamal Atzmon. Certainly, if you walk under a camel, that's very ill-advised. I don't know why you forget your learning because it'll kick you in the head, but you forget your learning. Over ben shnei malim, if you cross between 2 camels. Over ben shnei nashim, if you cross between 2 women. Isha over ben shnei nashim, or a woman who goes between 2 men. Over mitachad reach rash on the beila, if you walk under the bad smell of a dead carcass. Over tachta gesher, if you walk under a bridge, shalavru tachta mayim arba'im yom, that there's no water there 40 days, so I guess it's dried off. Ochel pat shlo b'shal kol tzarkov, if you eat bread that's not baked properly. Ochel basar mizuam alistrin, if you eat meat that comes from zuam alistrin, which comes from, usually that means that the zuam alistrin is a fork that they would put in that would remove the zuama, right? Meaning you would have the junk that goes when you cook meat, you get the disgusting stuff on top and you would take it off. If you use that spoon to eat, you're gonna you're going to get sick. If you drink from a stream that goes through a cemetery, if you stare at the face of dead people, and so too if you read ktav, if you read the writing on a grave. So if you spend time staring at the grave, all of these things are bad for you. I discourage them. I don't think most of these are physical. I think they're a little bit more from simana that we've talked about. They are more metaphysical, let's say. So we will stop there at the, I'll put on the thing, the first wide line, and tomorrow, God willing, everyone will finish and make a siyum on Masechet Horayot, so that next week when we meet, we'll be learning Zvachim, right? Excitement.
That's what we're supposed. Yeah, so I'm not gonna be here. I'm going to LA on Wednesday, God willing.
For Rosh Hashanah?
Yeah.
Okay, well, have a wonderful trip and a Shana Tova.
Thank you. You too.
And we'll see you when you're back. How long are you going to stay?
I'm staying like almost 2 weeks. I'll be back on the 28th, so I'll miss that Shabbat also.
Well, we will miss you. But you'll be back for Sukkot.
I'm going to be away the entire month. I'm like actually I'll be here for Yom Kippur, and then Talia's coming back and we're going up to Binghamton for Sukkot. And we'll be here for that Chol HaMoed Sukkot, Shabbat for Sukkot, and then I'm going to Paris for 3 weeks.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well,
I have a wedding, and I figured out like why not, you know.
Enjoy, Miriam, and we'll miss you. I hope you can join whenever you can join.
Yeah, I'll try.
We'll do some zvachim and have a Shana Tova.
Shana Tova to everyone. Good to see you, Nava.
See you later,
Good to
Nava.
see you too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.